Professor Royal Raj S., who's going to talk about professionalism in law, Men in Black. Do we really know who we are? And as far as I recall, the Men in Black were aliens. I did see the movie at the time, but I'm not absolutely sure. But we have a video to run to start with. So let's go ahead with that, please.
Organizers and delegates, warm greetings of the day. Though separated physically, we are connected virtually. Thanks be to the technology that has made it possible. I consider it an honor and privilege to be part of this online Directions in Legal Education 2020 conference. And for the past 2 days, we had enlightened deliberations by various scholars on varied areas. It was indeed a learning experience. Today, my objective is to throw some light on the imminent need for professionalism in the field of law. On the 28th of May 1972, the Duke of Windsor, the uncrowned King Edward VIII, passed away in Paris. The same evening, a television program rehearsed the main event of his life, and extracts from earlier films were shown, in which he answered questions about his upbringing, brief reign, and abdication. Recalling his boyhood as the Prince of Wales, he said, referring to his father, who was King George V, he said, "My father was a strict disciplinarian. Sometimes, when I had done something wrong, he would admonish me by saying, 'My dear boy, you must always remember who you are. My dear boy, you must always remember who you are.'" The fact that he was a prince, son of a king, impacted his behavior. Unfortunately, the members of the legal fraternity many times forget their glorious position in the society. Ignorance of our place of standing or our locus standi certainly isn't bliss. It can have serious ramifications in the way we walk and talk. To be a little more precise, we are called to know our heritage so as to maintain our professionalism. The next obvious question is, where do we start with? Or how do we even trace our heritage? You've guessed it right. Let's trace our beginning. Even before we start, I can't help but cite the words of late Mr. Ravi Zacharias, who remarked thus, and I quote, "When one asserts that there is such a thing as evil, one must assume there is such a thing as good. When one assumes there is such a thing as good, he or she must also assume there is an objective moral law by which to distinguish between good and evil. When you assume an objective moral law, you must also posit a moral lawgiver, who is the source of the moral law." End quote. In short, what we saw is a rational argument pointing us to a moral lawgiver. In jurisprudential terms, we have Thomas Aquinas, who was extensively written on natural law and divine law. The idea of divine revelation is, of course, the idea that once the created universe developed to the point that it included created minds, the transcendent creator could now communicate information not simply by impressing it on the storm of activity that we now call as the material universe, but now also by conveying it to understanding minds in the form of propositions, arguments, warnings, predictions, and directives that appeal to freedom and contemplate rejection. The legitimacy of this statement is also affirmed right at the creation of the mankind, wherein the created couple were given a law by the supreme lawgiver not to eat from the forbidden tree. Legal profession or law as it stands today is no fairy tale or a myth, but a command having a divine seal. You might say, but we are not in a theocracy governed directly by God. Agreed. Some parts of the world follow democracy, monarchy, etc. But a pertinent point to note is that the rulers and those in power share a delegated authority. When I say delegated, I mean delegated from the divine lawgiver. A delegated authority is someone who represents that divine authority. The supreme moral lawgiver designates or commissions certain people to exercise authority over the subjects. That's precisely the reason why kings and rulers were deemed as representatives of God. In a democracy, people elect the functionaries of a state. Nevertheless, they still fall under the scope of delegated authority and they become the modern day sovereigns. As jurist Austin rightly said, law is the command of the sovereign. According to the notion of divine law, God becomes the ultimate sovereign, and the human rulers exercise the delegated authority as reposed on them. Having said this, the point driven home is the fact that the mankind in various capacities has been commissioned to uphold the majesty of law. Being part of the legal fraternity, in any capacity, be it attorneys, judicial officers, or being members of the legal academia, we are all part of a divine project establishing law and order. And indeed, that's our grand lineage and origin. The moral lawgiver has entrusted us with an objective moral law, and being part of the legal fraternity, it's indeed an added privilege where some act in the capacity of enacting laws as legislators, some as interpreters of law, and some as enforcers of law. Roles might vary, but our ancestry or our heritage still remains the same. To further narrow down, we are all legal academics who are called to nurture and develop budding lawyers, and that is our profession. Henry Adams rightly said, a teacher affects all eternity. You never know where his influence stops. I repeat, a teacher affects all eternity. You never know where his influence stops. That's our profession. And we can certainly have lasting impact on the upcoming generation. At the same time, teaching with special reference to law again demands greater caution because we don't deal something in abstract, but with an area that in fact has a direct bearing on our day-to-day activities. For good or bad, our actions still matter. As a teacher, when we don't walk as we preach, we just end up to be hypocrites, and that becomes a dent on our professionalism. Just as our moral lawgiver is perfect, we, the members of the legal fraternity, also must remind ourselves frequently that we are the child of a righteous lawgiver. Our origin calls us to be professional, so does our office. In a classroom setting, though be it on the virtual space, even beyond the four walls, the teachers ought to be second parents, guiding, molding, and shaping the young minds, thereby facilitating them to align on the right trajectory. That's our mission. Seasoned academic Parker J. Palmer, his iconic work titled The Heart of a Teacher, notes the three paths which a teacher is called to take on. And they are as follows: intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. Out of these three, none can be ignored. Because if we reduce teaching to mere intellect, it becomes cold abstraction. When you reduce teaching to emotions, it just becomes narcissistic. When you reduce it to spiritual, it loses its anchor to the world. Intellect, emotion, and spirit depend on each other for wholeness. They are interwoven in the human self and in education at its best. And we need to interweave them in our pedagogical discourse as well. By intellectual, Parker means the way we think about teaching and learning, the form and content of our concepts of how people know and learn, of the nature of students and our subjects. By emotional, the way we and our students feel as we teach and learn, feelings that can either enlarge or diminish the exchange between us. By spiritual, he means the diverse ways we answer the heart's longing to be connected with the largeness of life, a longing that animates love and work, especially the work called teaching. So, a perfect blend of these three factors, namely intellectual, emotional, and spiritual, will certainly help us fulfill our mission. Herein, I would also like to point out the fact that there is more to 10 keys to effective teaching, 5 reasons to stay committed to profession, etc. Techniques, methodologies, pedagogies are good. But there is a world beyond that, and we must never forget. Quoting Parker again, good teaching cannot be reduced to technique. Good teaching comes from the identity and integrity of the teacher. When we ourselves know our origin, identity, our commission, and the nobility of our office, our professionalism naturally flows down to our vicinity, including our classrooms. We spread the aroma of legal profession wherever we tread. In other words, the knowledge of who we are impacts all the spheres of our life, and living up to that standard is our mission. Let's never forget our future generations follow on the legacy that we as members of legal fraternity leave behind. So the primary question to ponder on is this: are we committed to our profession? As G.K. Chesterton aptly remarked, the true soldier fights not because he hates what is in front of him, but he loves what is behind him. I repeat, the true soldier fights not because he hates what is in front of him, but because he loves what is behind him. Our origin, our delegated authority, our vocation, our mission calls us to a life of professionalism. Quoting the words of King George V again, my dear boy, you must always remember who you are. My dear boy, you must always remember who you are. In light of all that we saw just now, who are we? We are the torch bearers of the divine law. We are commissioned to carry on the objective moral law with utmost truth and integrity. We are the privileged few, called as academics, to share our heritage. We are the members of legal fraternity, ordained for a specific mission. That is, to be that legal professional walking worthy of our calling. Inception, commission, vocation, and mission points us to our royal heritage and lineage. By the way, I don't pretend to be that perfect teacher, but I do struggle as a soldier to fight the good fight of being that ideal legal professional. Thank you all for your patient hearing. I once again thank the organizers for providing me this platform to share my views on professionalism. as I already pointed out, the past 2 days, and even today, it was a learning experience. It was great to hear from several distinguished scholars. Thanks again, and I'll be happy to hear from you. I'll be happy to take questions and feedbacks. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Royal. I see you're there unmuted, and please do send any questions you've got. I've actually got a question for you. It was very thought-provoking and extremely thought-provoking presentation. But I've got a couple of things I'd like to put to you. This is something actually, I was at university in the days when Professor Hart was very much in vogue, and the idea that any content in the law had to be obeyed. You seem to be, as well as talking about the kind of ethical principles that arise from, as you would call it, divine law, you also seem to be sanctioning some kind of test of compliance of actual laws with a kind of supreme law, with a divine law. Is that what you're? So you would agree with? I think it was Chief Justice Vaughan back in Thomas and Sorrell in the 1600s, I think it was, who said that a law that's inconsistent with God's law is no law at all. Is that what you're proposing?
Perfectly, sir. Right, sir. Perfectly. That's my argument, sir. It's on the ethical side.
And so in for example Nazi Germany, you would have said to the judges, you have to go to the you can't obey, you can't actually give out the sentences for promoting laws that your moral conscience doesn't permit. You would have given that advice, yeah.
See, even otherwise, we all have a conscience that directly points us to ethics. So even without God, there is a conscience that drives us all. So conscience can never be negated, even though we can reject God, but conscience can never be negated or silenced. That's what I believe.
All right. So, but that means that you are subordinating the rule of law to a higher law, right?
Not necessarily, sir. Of course, it all is a part of the same line. I feel same trajectory. Just the delegated authority, it all falls to the same line. Doesn't negate that rule of law comes secondary or whatever it is.
Well, it does when the two things conflict, because the rule of law would require the Professor Hart view of life, that a law can have any content. It's up to any. I mean, I think it's. I remember watching one of the TV programs about Henry VIII, and one of his advisors saying, the law is whatever the king says it is. So which is a fact was probably very, very true. But you would not subscribe to that view. You would say that there is a higher law which must be the yardstick for compliance, right?
Exactly, sir. Yeah, exactly.
And then how would you deal then with the kind of multicultural environment that I should say, I forgot to introduce you, but you're a professor, assistant professor of law at Tamil Nadu National University is it Tiruchirappalli, right?
Exactly.
In India. I mean, you live in a multicultural environment, taking the country as a whole, and I, coming from the United Kingdom, very much these days a multicultural environment too. How would and with cultures with some quite conflicting views about what constitutes a divine law, how would you reconcile that difficulty of finding a common morality, as you would call it?
As I told you earlier, what I was referring to is all about the objective moral law. Subjective moral law can be measured only by an objective moral standard. That's what I meant. And even as I reiterated already, it all again points to our conscience. Even if you can negate the concept of God or whatever it can be, our conscience says it all. So thereby, you can never ever go beyond the objective standards that are already there. Just by the change of times and trends, that doesn't mean that law per se is subjective.
All right, now
so I still subscribe to law standard.
Professor Nicholson, who's our next speaker, has got a question as well. I'll ask that. Do you therefore perceive a potential conflict between professionalism and employability would employers in general accept such a potential radical view of professionalism?
No, sir. Actually, thank you for your question, Professor. What I was trying to say is this professionalism is not disconnected from employability. Rather, this professionalism would enhance employability. So, when we know who we are, that will have a direct bearing on our employability as well. So, professionalism actually is an enhancer of employability, and it is in no way disconnecting employability. Both of them goes hand in hand. So, when it gets separated, there is no point of me talking this professionalism as well. So it goes hand in hand. That's what I'm trying to say.
But I still have the problem again in this multicultural world. I mean, I think you're risking playing into kind of racialism here. If you're saying there's an objective standard, but this objective standard doesn't, well, except to the extent, as I showed in my presentation, there are ethical rules that the IBA rules and so on, but they're very basic rules. You seem to be going much further than that in terms of your objective standard of professionalism. I mean, isn't that kind of playing into a racist agenda here, a racist narrative in the sense that if you're judging somebody who's in front of you for interview by your own standards, by those standards you, in your particular religious environment, you would apply, aren't you then suggesting that perhaps you would prefer a Muslim over a Christian or vice versa in certain contexts?
I don't think so, sir, because what I was talking to is certain objective standards which are common for all. So certain subjective preferences might vary, but I was not talking on that, but the objective preferences that are common to all. Say, for instance, murder or certain things which are common to all and everyone agrees that that's wrong. So I'm sticking on to that objective values. And of course, there is every possibility and there's scope for people to differ as well. So I would agree with them, but they can differ with my views, but that's okay. But I still conform to the objective standards, which I already told.
Is there anything published about, particularly applying to India, as I say, a multicultural environment? Is there anything published that, I mean, have you written on this material that actually deals with identifying what that common standard is? Because there are some quite radical differences in the beliefs of some of the religions that are extant in India, right?
Yeah, yes, right, sir. But all of them all subscribe to the common notion of certain objective things which everybody agrees. Say, for instance, with regard to the homosexuality and adultery and others, which were recently decriminalized in India, a vast majority still have a notion that the courts have overstepped their boundaries. So there are a minuscule population still asks for all these exceptions, but a vast majority of the population still subscribe to objective moral standards. So that's where my argument comes from. Of course, there are minority section that still says that we want liberalism and others, but there are a vast majority that still subscribes to objective standards.
And what about, for example, the position of women in India, which has been very much in the news in the last 12 months? Different groups have different views about the role of women. I mean, is it a common objective standard, just to go to a specific, is it a common objective standard in India that women should be absolutely treated equally with men in all respects?
Exactly, sir. Recently, we also had a landmark judgment that said that with regard to the practice of triple talaq, when the court tested that triple talaq in the light in the annual of Constitution of India, it says that women are free again. Women were subject to a lot of discriminatory practices by that religion, the Islamic religion, I would say. But when the Constitution when the Supreme Court stepped into on the annual of Constitution based on Article 14 and others, the court granted equality to women as well. So there again, you can see a common platform where women were given freedom. And in another case, women were not allowed entry into temples, women menstruating between 14 and 40. And later, the Supreme Court also tested the same and granted freedom to women. I think there is a common ground whereby women are still allowed, women are given freedom.
Well, with respect on that issue, I'm saying that women have been given freedom, in this year of 2020 and in the way that the rest of the world has developed, is not the same as saying that there is a shared common standard amongst professionals who'd be recruiting that would require them to treat women equally with men when there is recent legislation that has some bearing. I agree, but don't you think that in India there is a lot to do in terms of having that become a commonly accepted standard?
Yes, sir. There is still a lot of work to do. I still agree with you, sir. Perfectly agree with you. There is still a lot to do. Still, we don't have consensus on several aspects. That's true. Agreed, sir.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for that very thought-provoking and controversial, if I may say, presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.